Margaret Caldwell stepped forward, gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table. Her cardigan was a little too worn, her hands trembled slightly, but her posture remained steady. She wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be, just an old woman refusing to let her father's home be stolen by a corporate machine that saw people as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. The courtroom was already against her before she even spoke. They had underestimated her, dismissed her, treated her like a fool. But that would change soon enough. Judge Kenneth Braddock peered over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't far from it either. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "Miss Caldwell, representing yourself?" The question dripped with amusement. Margaret met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." A chuckle echoed from the other side of the room. Stephen Holloway, the opposing attorney, adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease, a corporate bulldog with a track record of steamrolling small-time defendants. Holloway was here to do what he did best, win. And Margaret? She wasn't even a challenge. "This should be quick," Holloway muttered under his breath to his assistant, who gave a knowing smile. Margaret heard it. She was supposed to hear it. That was the point. But she kept her face still. She'd been counted out before. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated. That was why she was here. The judge let out a sigh, flipping through a file. "This is a property dispute, correct? A foreclosure challenge?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, sir. My father's home." Braddock barely glanced at her. "And you believe you can argue this case against a seasoned attorney like Mr. Holloway?" Margaret didn't flinch. "I don't believe, Your Honor." "I know." The courtroom went quiet. A few muffled chuckles came from the corporate side of the room, but there was something else, too. Something unspoken. The kind of silence that comes when someone unexpected refuses to back down. Judge Braddock shook his head. "Very well. Let's get on with it." But Margaret wasn't just here to argue. She was here to win, and they had no idea what was coming. The judge's skepticism was only the beginning. The real challenge sat across the aisle, the man who thought Margaret had already lost. Holloway adjusted his tie with a smug smile. This was his playground, the courtroom, the rules, the strategy. He had crushed dozens like Margaret Caldwell before, an old woman with no degree, no firm backing her, no experience. This wasn't a case. It was a warm-up. Judge Braddock exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Holloway, you may proceed with your opening statement." Holloway rose with practiced ease, buttoning his jacket as he stepped toward the jury. His voice was smooth, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple." He gestured toward Margaret without even looking at her. "We have a woman who refuses to accept reality. The property in question was rightfully acquired by my client through legal foreclosure. The law is clear. The facts are irrefutable. This is not about emotion. This is about contracts, deadlines, and obligations. My client followed the law. Miss Caldwell did not." A well-placed pause, a slow turn, then a casual shrug. "I sympathize. Losing a home is painful, but pain does not override legal responsibility. The numbers don't lie." He nodded once toward the judge and then took his seat, hands folded, as if the case was already over. Margaret sat still, unmoved. She'd expected this, but as she rose from her seat, she caught the way Judge Braddock leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a man watching something he didn't believe would be worth his time. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen," Margaret cleared her throat, her voice steady. "Mr. Holloway is right about one thing. The law is clear. The question is, does his client actually follow it?" A flicker of irritation crossed Holloway's face. Margaret continued, "I've spent the last 6 months studying every case, every statute, every loophole that banks and corporations use to strip homes away from families. And I found something." Judge Braddock raised an eyebrow. "Something?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, and it changes everything." Holloway let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, this should be good." Margaret ignored him. Instead, she turned to the judge. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official request for discovery, because I have reason to believe the plaintiff is hiding something." The courtroom shifted. Judge Braddock sat forward, his expression less amused now. Hiding what, Miss Caldwell? Margaret's gaze locked onto Holloway. Fraud. And just like that, the room wasn't laughing anymore. The word fraud lingered in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Holloway's smirk faded, and for the first time, Judge Braddock gave Margaret more than just a passing glance. Fraud. The judge's voice carried a note of skepticism, but there was something else beneath it. Curiosity. Margaret nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I believe the foreclosure on my father's home was based on forged documents. And I can prove it if I'm allowed to request full discovery. Holloway let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Your Honor, this is absurd. A baseless accusation meant to stall the inevitable. The property was seized under standard foreclosure proceedings. Margaret tilted her head. Standard. She took a step forward, her voice steady. Tell me, Mr. Holloway, how standard is it for a bank to foreclose on a house when the original mortgage documents have two different signatures from the same person? The courtroom rustled. A few murmurs broke out in the gallery. Holloway's jaw clenched. What are you talking about? Margaret reached into her folder and pulled out 2 copies of the original mortgage agreement. She walked over to the bailiff and handed them up to the judge. These are 2 separate copies of the same document, Your Honor. One from the initial filing and one from a later modification. If you look at the signatures, you'll notice they don't match. Judge Braddock leaned in, scanning the papers. His forehead creased. Margaret continued. Now, I'm no expert, but I know my father's signature. And that second one? That's not his. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from dismissive to focused. He looked up at Holloway. Mr. Holloway, do you have an explanation for this? Holloway cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is an attempt to confuse the issue. Signatures can change over time. Margaret didn't let up. Maybe, but that second signature is from a document filed only 3 months after the original. And if you compare them side by side, she pointed toward the papers in the judge's hand, you'll see that not only do they look completely different, but the second one was signed the day after my father was hospitalized for a stroke. A wave of reaction rippled through the courtroom. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Braddock turned back to Holloway. His tone was firmer now. Mr. Holloway, does your client have the original signed documents on file? Holloway hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable. But Margaret saw it, and so did the judge. And this was only the beginning.